Well, I was planning on tackling some other topics related to the Bible, and then this happened.
Roe versus Wade essentially upended. The most restrictive abortion law in the country went into effect in Texas. It essentially bans all abortions after 6 weeks.
There are no exceptions under this new law for rape or incest. The only exceptions for medical emergencies.
Well, in Florida, it's highly likely to happen. There will be a lookalike law proposed.
So I guess we're talking about abortion. Anti-abortion Christians have done a good job of presenting opposition to abortion as a universally Christian value, as a position built into the foundation of their religion in the same way that prayer or loving your neighbor is. And yet this wasn't always the case. Before the 1980s, religious opposition to abortion was sometimes framed by members of other Christian churches as a Catholic issue because of the Roman Catholic Church's tendency to cast all intentional abortions as mortal sins, even when they saved the life of the woman carrying the fetus. If anything, some non-Catholic Christians were worried that Catholics would impose their stringent anti-abortion views on everyone else. When Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, for example, the Baptist press ran an approving profile of Linda Coffey, one of the attorneys who argued on the side of Roe, that is, for access to abortion. Coffey emphasized that it would tear her up personally to have to make a decision on abortion except in the early stages, but that the court decision compels no woman to receive an abortion against her personal religious convictions. An op-ed published 2 days later by W. Barry Garrett declared, "The U.S. Supreme Court has advanced the cause of religious liberty, human equality, and justice." This makes sense since 2 years earlier, the Southern Baptist Convention, now one of the most vocally anti-abortion churches in America, supported legislation allowing abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. A position Southern Baptists reaffirmed twice more in 1974 and 1976 after Roe v. Wade. Even as attitudes toward abortion shifted, the SBC continued to advocate for the limited role of government in dealing with matters relating to abortion as late as 1979. A year later, though, the SBC barred all abortions except to save the life of the mother, which is still its position. And despite the rhetorical grounding of their position in vague biblical references, the SBC had begun to sound almost Roman Catholic in its attitude toward abortion. Only this time it wasn't the influence of theologians on how they felt about the procedure, but politics. As Randall Ballmer traces, Republicans needed a new issue to rally conservatives after school segregation was finally overturned, and making abortion into a Christian issue was a very effective replacement. It got people to the polls. And it still does. Despite the fact that less than a third of Americans support repealing Roe v. Wade, and less than half of Texans actually supported the recent 6-week ban, it still got passed. It's important to note that not all Christians oppose abortion, at least not in the blanket manner that official church bodies like the Roman Catholic Church or the Southern Baptist Convention do. In fact, according to a Lifeway poll from 2015, most women who get abortions attend church, and they attend anti-abortion churches proportionally. Meanwhile, the official positions of some Christian churches recognize some abortions beyond just saving the life of the mother. Rabidly anti-abortion Christians are just often the loudest. So how can some Christian groups approve at least of some abortions? And even if they generally disapproved of the practice, how did some Christians think it wasn't a specifically religious issue before the 1980s? Because abortion's not a biblical issue, at least not directly. It may only appear in one passage where a prophet, inspired by God, regrets that an abortion didn't take place. So then the real question becomes, how do Jewish and Christian readers turn abortion into a biblical issue? Let's ask some critical questions in this episode of Sounds Like BS, Abortion in the Bible. Now, I want to be clear up front that I'm not here to discuss the ethics or legality of abortion. This isn't a video about whether abortion is right or wrong. This is a video about whether or not the Bible discusses abortion. And as we'll see, in most cases, you have to do a lot of work to get the Bible to say something about abortion when it's really talking about something else. The prophet Jeremiah's life was rough. But then again, he's sort of the kind of guy that if his life sucks, he wants everyone to know about it. At one point, after spending a night in the stocks, Jeremiah curses the man who announced his birth because he did not kill me in the womb. So my mother would have been my grave and her womb forever great. So there is some ambiguity here. If his mother's womb would always be large, it's possible that he's wishing the man had killed his mother while she was pregnant with him so that he would never be born. So it's not really an abortion, it's a murder that has a secondary effect on him. And if that sounds unnecessarily cruel to Jeremiah's mother, well, he is a bit of a drama queen. But there's the more likely possibility that he's using hyperbolic language to talk about abortion. The point is, Jeremiah, possessed by God's prophetic spirit, wishes an abortion had taken place, his own. And if so, this is the only explicit reference to abortion in the Bible. Now, if you Google Jeremiah and abortion, that passage is probably not the first one to come up. Instead, they'll more likely point to the opening chapter, where Jeremiah claims, Yahweh's word came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Taken out of context, anti-abortion Christians choose to focus on the fact that God knew Jeremiah and had plans for him that went beyond gestation. Now, it's a long set of steps from God knew Jeremiah before he was born to all fetuses have full personhood, so let's fill in some of the gaps a bit. On the one hand, saying God knew him before he was born says something utterly common about God, since God knows all things at all times. If God knows all of human history thousands of years into the future, he probably knows something about a guy who will be born in less than a year. In another text, an angel voices plans regarding John the Baptist before he's even conceived. And according to Christian tradition, God spoke about John centuries before he was born. That doesn't mean that John had full personhood before his grandparents' were born, just that John is special and God knows about it, like he always does. If we choose to focus on these prophets instead, then the point of saying God had plans for them so early on is to mark them as special people, not typical ones. Jeremiah and John later became prophets, so it's worth noting that God had plans for them. Second, anti-abortion readers infer that because God had plans for Jeremiah, he has plans for every fetus that include making it to term. That's a big leap. God's plans for Jeremiah include him acting as a prophet at a specific date when Jeremiah is in his 60s. Successfully being brought to term is prerequisite to that. The prophet also couldn't have been killed by a lion when he was 3, or caught in a fire at 11, or get pneumonia and die at 27. Other people could. Other people did. Just not this guy specifically. God has other plans for him. The opening of Jeremiah doesn't necessarily say anything about even Jeremiah's personhood, much less every fetus in the world. Many other fetuses don't make it to term, in Jeremiah's time or in ours. About a quarter of pregnancies end in miscarriage even today. And largely due to economic and health policies supported by anti-abortion activists, US infants die at an alarming rate for a developed country even after they're born. And when this happens, it's not uncommon to hear Christians comfort these women by telling them that it was God's will. But this sort of paints them into a corner. If a miscarriage or the death of an infant is God's will, then evidently it's not always God's plan for embryos, fetuses, and newborns to live into adulthood. Which, while tragic, makes the first chapters of Jeremiah or Luke irrelevant to a discussion about abortion. So yes, God had plans for someone special who would become his prophet, and he had enough forethought to make those plans before the kid was born. It doesn't necessarily follow that God has similar grandiose plans for every fetus, or that we could know the mind of God and know what his plans were even if we wanted to, unless we choose to make that interpretive choice for ourselves. Now, Jeremiah may be the only prophet to speak explicitly about abortion, but there are other passages that readers apply to the issue. It's just that 2 from the prophet Moses don't really support a case against abortion. In the book of Numbers, Moses describes a case where a husband suspects his wife of cheating on him with an intercourse of seed, but she wasn't caught in the act and he has no proof. Still, a spirit of jealousy has possessed him, meaning at the very least that he's just not going to get over it. If so, he can take his wife to a priest of Yahweh to perform a ritual. Now, the ritual is a whole thing, but what we'll focus on is that she has to drink what the text calls bitter waters. If she experiences pain but her womb doesn't swell and her thigh doesn't sag, then she's innocent. If it does, then she did cheat, and her husband can punish her for adultery. This passage has drawn attention largely due to the mention of bitter waters and their effects on the woman. There's evidence of abortifacient teas in Egypt dating from centuries before even the traditional date of the Exodus. That is, herbs that one could steep in water that would cause a miscarriage in a pregnant woman if she were to drink the tea. These herbs are often bitter to the taste, so doctors recommend taking them with honey to cut the bitterness. And depending on the herb, proper dosage was key. Slightly too little and nothing happened. Slightly too high a dose of herbs like pennyroyal and the woman could die. So you'd want someone practiced and precise to administer the tea, like, say, a priest. Rules against adultery protected husbands from raising children who weren't theirs back before paternity tests were a thing yet. If the wife were pregnant with another man's baby, say after her husband had been away for a while, then if she drank the abortifacient tea, she would have a miscarriage. Her womb would discharge the embryo blood and excess uterine lining, proving that she cheated and keeping the husband from raising a child who wasn't his. If she were not pregnant, she might have a little belly pain, but otherwise she'd be fine. That looks an awful lot like what's happening in this ritual. This reading comes from choosing to find a natural set of events that are given a supernatural explanation in the Torah, but all we have is the supernatural explanation. Self-professed literalists have no need to go looking for a natural explanation. The Israelite priest really does work together with God to either convict the woman of adultery or to absolve her. But this does raise a real problem. If they take this reading of the passage at its word and the woman is pregnant, then it would be God who aborts the pregnancy. Now, another passage, this time from Exodus, is also problematic for anti-abortion readers. It's a case law that describes some people getting into a fight and accidentally injuring a pregnant woman in the fray. Here's the problem. If they only cause her to miscarry, then her husband can sue the person responsible for a fine approved by a judge. However, if the woman is injured, then you will give life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, so on and so forth. The law seems to differentiate between hurting the woman and ending the pregnancy. And even more troublesome, it explicitly says the fetus is not covered by the principle of a life for a life. Friedman and Delansky, in their book The Bible Now, argue that this passage has no relevance to the issue of abortion. After all, it's an accidental forced miscarriage caused by violence, not a medical procedure. And I agree that the act described here has no relevance to abortion, but the language is relevant to the rhetoric used by anti-abortion readers. One of the pillars of their argument is that a fetus is fully alive, fully human from the moment of conception. If we read this as saying the fetus is not covered by a life for a life, the question is, why? So is it because the ethics regarding a fetus are different than they are for a birthed human? Or do they not consider the fetus to be fully alive? Either way, it raises serious questions about the biblical basis for the rhetoric behind many anti-abortion arguments. Okay, so turning to the New Testament, some anti-abortion Christians would argue that abortion is forbidden under the umbrella of the commandment not to murder. And unlike the previous two commandments, Jesus actually endorses the commandment not to murder in the New Testament. Of course, this is a bit of a circular argument, since one of the main points of contention between pro-choice and anti-abortion Christians is whether or not to consider abortion a form of murder. So they would have to show that the writers of the New Testament had abortion specifically in mind when they condemned murder, and also had a reasonable expectation that their audience would pick up on that when they read it. That seems like a much bigger task. The earliest evidence of Christian opposition to abortion in the 2nd century teaching of the 12 apostles, or the Didache, does condemn abortion using murder language. In chapter 2, the Didache begins with the 10 Commandments but soon goes off script. You will not murder. You will not commit adultery. You will not abuse a boy. Yada yada yada. You will not murder a child to or by destruction, nor kill one who has been born. Destruction was a euphemism for abortion, so it seems to condemn both aborting a pregnancy and infanticide, which was much more common in the 2nd century than it is now. Texts like this do demonstrate that at least some later Christians disapproved of abortion. And it explains why Catholic and Orthodox churches disapproved on a religious level even when other churches didn't. It's part of their tradition, with a big T. But the Didache didn't make it into any Bibles, so it doesn't really support an argument that the Bible condemns abortion. Now, one way of testing the hypothesis that general condemnations of murder include abortion is to ask whether any of the texts in the New Testament use murder language broadly enough to allow room for it. If I say he murdered an old man, there's no room for abortion. The victim set is too narrow. He is guilty of murder, however, allows for the possibility that I mean he murdered fetuses. There are several citations of the commandment, you will not murder, and this is certainly broad. At least they don't specify the type of victim, so it could include a fetus. Yet the Didache quotes the commandment not to murder separately from the command not to perform abortion. Apparently, Moses' language was too broad to specify abortion for the writers of the Didache, our earliest explicit evidence. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the verb used in the commandment names or implies adult victims, never general enough to include fetuses. If only the commandment is available, we're left in the same circular argument we began with. Now, Jeremiah uses a different word to describe his own abortion. It just means to kill, and that word is used dozens of times in the New Testament. Overwhelmingly, it refers to executions or the murder of adults, at least of people capable of fearing others. The few cases of kill with open-ended victims are, if anything, kind of awkward for people who claim it refers to abortion. Paul, for example, says, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. The letter probably doesn't abort pregnancies, but maybe he's thinking of Moses. In Revelation, angels kill a third of humanity, a statement general enough to include millions of fetuses, but where death also comes from heaven, that is, from God. And more to the point, the fetuses only die because angels kill their mothers, which is not what abortion rights activists are advocating. An even more awkward statement comes earlier in Revelation when the risen Christ condemns a woman he calls Jezebel. He promises to throw her on a bed and bring great tribulation on those who commit adultery with her and to kill her children. Now, one common reason abortion was condemned by non-Christian writers in the 1st century was because it helped to hide adultery. The phrasing in Revelation is even similar to the Didache's. Taken out of context, Christ's actions in Revelation read almost as a violation of the commandment in the Didache. You will not murder a child by destruction, nor will you kill one who has been born. Oh yeah? I will kill her children by death. Now, from a critical perspective, we infer that the woman symbolically named Jezebel is a rival Christian leader whom John does not approve of, and her children are her followers whom he condemns. However, if taken literally, this is the only case of kill paired with sexual imagery. The victims are a woman's offspring, and the glorified Christ kills them. Taken literally, only Christ aborts in the New Testament. But it is highly doubtful that we should take the apocalyptic passage literally any more than the dragons and seven-headed beasts. There's a chance that maybe some of the writers in the New Testament would have thought of abortion as murder. But there's just no clear evidence that they had abortion in mind when condemning murder in the text they wrote. The New Testament leaves us, as readers, either choosing to hear this resonance or not. Well, if kill language makes Revelation look mildly pro-abortion, at least if John doesn't like you. In his book, Abortion in the Early Church, Michael Gorman reads Revelation the opposite way in another passage. Ancient Jewish and Christian texts occasionally condemn sorcery, which is the use of potions as opposed to magic. Paul condemns sorcery in Galatians, and in Revelation, John says that all the nations were deceived by the sorcery of the whore of Babylon. The word used here is pharmakeia, where we get our word pharmaceuticals. And abortifacient herbs, whether taken as a tea or as a vaginal suppository, theoretically fell under the umbrella of pharmakeia. Gorman suggests that when Paul or John condemns pharmakeia, they're making an oblique reference to abortion. Unfortunately, Gorman's argument runs into trouble at the level of probability. In Soreness's medical text on women, Gorman points to a contemporary precedent for actually referring to abortifacients directly as pharmakeia. And according to Soreness scholars, there's even some doubt whether that particular passage was original to the text, so from the 1st century, or was added centuries later. In other words, there are many words for referring to abortion, but the probability of using pharmakeia is either extremely small or non-existent. Conversely, pharmakeia is a very common word used for many things besides abortion. It simply means drugs or potions. Depending on the context, pharmakeia can refer to healing drugs, poisons, or to concoctions used in sorcery, even love potions, and paradoxically, fertility aids. There's a wide range of meanings for pharmakeia, so reducing it to one very questionable definition requires considerable justification. You probably have to already dislike abortion and choose to find any way you can to find a reference to it here. Now, as we've seen, over time, some Orthodox Christians became overtly anti-abortion, and it troubled them that the Bible never condemns the act. So early Christians also went looking for it in their Bibles. And one of the oldest ways to read abortion into the Bible comes from language used in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, when the pregnant Elizabeth meets Mary, she says that the child in her womb leapt for joy. The word he uses for child is brephos. And elsewhere, Luke uses the same word to refer to the newborn Jesus or to other newborns. It's comparable to referring to a fetus as the baby in modern English, which doesn't really tell you anything about the person's philosophies of personhood. So Luke seems to think of fetuses and newborns as brephoi, suggesting to some that for him, birth doesn't create a significant change in the human. Maybe as far back as Clement of Alexandria, this overlap of vocabulary in Luke has been used to equate fetuses and newborns, which would make abortion a form of infanticide. This is the oldest and most textual argument, and maybe the strongest, but we have to be clear about what it shows and what it doesn't. What we have is an observation about one text's vocabulary from which we may or may not choose to extrapolate a moral position. After all, Luke doesn't bother. The dispute about the personhood of a fetus is largely a modern one, although there were discussions about when life truly began. The perceived starting point, though, varied widely. There's very little indication that life was perceived to begin at conception, since conception was just the point where you initially mix two fluids, blood and semen, a sort of baby batter that would one day become a human with the proper application of heat. Remember, this is the ancient world. They don't know anything about cells and DNA or whatnot. Many ancient writers put the moment when a fetus became human at the point when the fetus formed into something recognizably human. St. Augustine, for example, follows the Septuagint version of Exodus 21 in differentiating between the formed and the unformed fetus. If a fetus is unformed, Augustine does not consider abortion to be homicide, even if he otherwise disapproves. Another milestone is quickening, or the first sensation of movement in the womb. St. Thomas Aquinas pinpointed quickening as the moment when an intellectual soul entered the body, making the fetus fully human. Prior to quickening, the tissue is only potentially human since it doesn't have a full human soul yet. An even larger number of discussions place the milestone at birth or the baby's first breath. Prior to that, the fetus was considered part of its mother, like a fruit still on the branch. Still, others push the point even later. Although he disagrees, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher and contemporary of Jesus, casually mentions that most people do not consider a child to be human if it could not yet eat food other than milk. That's why Moses' parents cried when they threw him in a river when he was 3 months old. They had simply waited too long and he had become a person to them. There are many different views about when humans came to life, so Luke's not endorsing or even assuming a single widespread view. We can't jump to conclusions about Luke's vocabulary without more evidence, which we simply don't have. Maybe Luke does not see a fetus 6 months into gestation, so at least 24 weeks, potentially viable today, as any different from a newborn. but by then it's already formed and quickened, so there's little relevance to conception. One may choose to read Luke's peculiar vocabulary as evidence for a view of fetuses shared by modern anti-abortion Christians in one New Testament text. One also has to decide whether it's strong enough to carry the weight of an argument for the full personhood of the fetus at conception, or even 6 weeks into gestation. In theory, there are two principles that Bible-centered Christians use to let the Bible guide them in the world. Everything in the Bible is important, and everything important is in the Bible. In practice, of course, both fail. Abortion has become very important to Christians as a legal and ethical issue. I have no reason to doubt that when most Christians protest against abortion, it's because they genuinely view the procedure as an assault on a fetus that they have the political power to prevent, assuming they restrict the freedoms of pregnant women. But we also have to be aware that being anti-abortion has become an important mark of Christian identity, whatever the actual principles of actual Christians. This is why you hear about politicians elected for their anti-abortion views paying for their mistresses' abortions. They're not anti-abortion, it just gets them the evangelical vote. Look, I knew a bunch of Catholic school guys in high school who liked to have unprotected sex and would joke that only sluts get pregnant. But if they ever got a girl pregnant, they would, quote, kick her in the stomach and throw her down the stairs. That's still an abortion, dude. It's just also assault and battery. But hey, at least they're not taking her to a clinic. These same dudes actively protested against abortion, sometimes traveling all the way to Washington, D.C. to do it. Being vocally anti-abortion was just a really important part of their Christian social identity. If abortion is that important, it must be in the Bible. We have to find it, whether it's there or not. Well, it's not. Not really. There are a number of passages that anti-abortion or pro-choice readers can interpret, together with other passages and other social and cultural ideals, to make them apply to the issue of abortion. But that interpretation is their creation. Nothing in the text compels them to mash those pieces together in that particular way. The first principle also fails, which is that everything in the Bible is important. The Bible repeatedly condemns things like gossip and judging others. Yet according to that 2015 Lifeway poll, many women don't seek counseling from their churches when thinking about ending a pregnancy because they fear they'll be the subject of gossip and judgment in their churches. A good number of our political leaders openly practice vices like creating factions, being boastful or arrogant, or showing rage without any punishment at the polls from self-identified Christians, despite these being explicitly condemned in the Bible, unlike abortion. My point in saying all this is not to change anyone's mind on the issue of abortion. As Linda Coffey highlighted in 1973, one can be against abortion for oneself personally without also seeking to make it illegal for all women, regardless of their religious views. The decision to have an abortion can be a very difficult one for women to make. And if you know someone in that position, you may advise them to keep the pregnancy, so long as you also listen to their real concerns about the health, safety, and economic well-being of the child after it's born. Or you may advise them to end the pregnancy, just make sure you have 10 grand laying around if you live in Texas. My point is only that the silence of the Bible on abortion leaves Christians who rely on the Bible for their ethical views firmly on the hook for what they think about the procedure. The rhetoric of many opponents to abortion access suggests they would prefer a clear answer. They would rather say, the Bible tells me that abortion is wrong. It may, but only when certain passages, selected by the reader, are interpreted through a certain interpretive strategy, also selected by the reader, and the reader chooses to give authority to his or her own interpretation. That's a level of responsibility that many readers just don't want. But it's a responsibility they have to accept if they want to make a biblical argument against abortion, since the text just doesn't do it for you. Meanwhile, if you believe in a woman's right to make medical decisions regarding her own body, then it's up to you to have honest, critical conversations with Christians when they try to use the Bible as a shield protecting them from explaining their beliefs or why their particular religious belief should be imposed on all women, Christian or not. Ask them where and how abortion is condemned in the Bible, and discuss their answers frankly and openly, and hopefully, if you can muster it, generously. And then get off your ass and vote if you want things to be different.